Hi everyone, I'm excited to be here with you today. We're just gonna give it a few minutes and let people log in. We're coming to you live from Toronto, Ontario, and I'm really excited to be here. So where are some of you guys today? I think most of us are probably in Canada, but some of my friends from the States might have logged in. So go ahead and you can leave a comment if you want. I'm gonna be going through a lot of information today. So I am going to leave a little bit of time at the end to answer some questions. So feel free to ask those as I go, and I'll answer as many as I can at the end. Okay, Eric from Central Kentucky, TJ from Spokane, Washington, Christy from California. So that's a lot of my US friends. Okay, V from Port Elgin. Hi. Robert from Montreal. This is really cool. All right, guys, well, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Leslie, and I run Oak&Feather Decor, where I create custom one-of-a-kind wood art, primarily using my scroll saw. I'm really excited to be here today with Lee Valley Tools to take you through the basics of the scroll saw, as well as share some of my favorite tips and tricks so you can get started creating your own projects. So to begin, what is a scroll saw? Differing from a bandsaw that uses a blade that operates in a continuous loop, the scroll saw uses a small reciprocating blade that's easily removed so you can create detailed and intricate pieces. Scroll saws are classified in size by the length of their throat. I have my DeWalt DW788 scroll saw with me today, and this is a 20-inch scroll saw. That 20 inches refers to the distance from the back of the saw to where the blade attaches. So on the DeWalt saw, that space is 20 inches. There are a wide variety of saws on the market today, and they do vary in size. However, I can tell you that the size of your saw does not necessarily limit the size of your project. As I go through the various things today, including different blades and materials, I'm going to be showing you that it's possible to create not only detailed and intricate pieces, but also very large pieces as well. Scroll saws have a standardized blade size, and that is 5 inches. That's the distance between the chuck heads at the top and the bottom of your saw where the blade attaches. And as I said, that's standardized on every saw. Most saws on the market today take a plain end blade. And what that simply means is that at either end of the blade, it is flat, allowing it to be bolted into your saw. However, there are some older model scroll saws that take what is known as a pinned blade that looks something like this. It's fairly small. I'm not sure you'll be able to see it, but at the top and the bottom of these style blades, there's a pin on either side. Again, these are typically older model saws, and what you'll have to do with those is slot them into your machine and possibly use a tool to attach them. You are still able to create some really cool projects with that style of scroll saw. You're just limited in terms of the intricacy because with that style blade, you will have to drill a larger pilot hole in order to feed the blade through. So when you are looking at scroll saw blades, there are a ton of different types, and I'm going to be going through them with you today. The first thing that you need to be aware of when you're looking at scroll saw blades is that they are numbered. And the rule to keep in mind is the lower the number of the blade, the higher the teeth per inch, and the thinner the blade. The higher the number of the blade, the lower the teeth per inch, and the thicker the blade. When you look at a typical scroll saw blade package, this is just one that I use quite frequently, there are a lot of numbers that you're going to be seeing. The first one is what I just talked about, the blade number. So this one here is a number 3, and this one here is a number 5. On this blade package, the next number you'll see is the teeth per inch, or TPI. So again, the lower the number, the blade, the higher the TPI. So for the number 3, that's 12.4. And then the higher the number of the blade, the lower the TPI. So on the number 5, it's 11.3. The next numbers on this style blade package refer to the width of the blade. So again, the lower the number, the thinner the blade. And then the next number there is the kerf, or the trace. That's the amount of material that is going to be removed as you are cutting. And again, the higher the number of the blade, the thicker it will be, so more material will be removed. However, keep in mind, scroll saw blades in nature are very thin, so the amount of material being removed is very minimal, even if you're using the most aggressive cutting blade. When you first get your scroll saw, you pull it out of the package, you typically have a blade pack with a few sample blades. Those are typically regular tooth scroll saw blades that look something like this. So all of the teeth are pointing in one direction and they are evenly spaced. This is a pretty aggressive cutting blade. It can be used to cut a wide variety of materials as well as a variety of thicknesses. It's not something I use quite frequently due to the aggressive nature of this blade. However, if you're just starting out, you're looking to make some practice cuts, some simple shapes, it's a really great blade to start off with. The next style blade is a skip tooth blade. So you can see it looks very similar to a regular tooth blade. All of the teeth are evenly spaced and pointing in one direction, which is down. However, the skip tooth blade has a larger gap between the teeth. What that means is this blade is a much more aggressive cutting blade. It's also able to handle harder and thicker materials. Because of the larger gap between the teeth, this blade also has less friction, meaning it will heat up less frequently and it will break less frequently as well due to that. The next style blade is a reverse tooth blade. So reverse tooth blades are characterized by the majority of the teeth pointing down and then a smaller section of the teeth pointing up. Those are the reverse teeth. What that means is this blade is cutting in both directions for a very smooth and clean cut. Similar to the reverse tooth, we have our double reverse tooth blades. Double reverse tooth blades are virtually the same, the large amount of teeth pointing down, small section pointing up, but there are literally double the teeth. What that means is this blade has a higher TPI, meaning it will be faster cutting. It's also very clean cutting due to that double reverse tooth, and it can handle thicker and more hard materials. A modified geometry or MGT blade combines the technology of a skip tooth and a reverse tooth blade. So most of the teeth are pointing down, you have a small section pointing up, but the gap between those teeth is larger, just like your skip tooth blade. What that means is this is a fast, aggressive cutting blade that has more longevity than your typical reverse tooth blades because it won't break as frequently due to overheating. This is a spiral tooth blade. So as I mentioned before, the size of your scroll saw doesn't necessarily limit the size of the projects that you will be able to create. A spiral tooth blade is characterized by the teeth literally spiraling around the blade. What that means is they have a very high TPI, meaning it's a fast cutting, aggressive blade. And because those teeth spiral around, this blade is cutting in all directions. The straight tooth blades, when you are cutting, you will be required to spin your work in order to make corners and cuts. With the spiral tooth blade, because it's cutting in every direction, you won't have to spin your work and therefore be limited by the length of the throat. The spiral tooth blade is cutting in every direction, so you simply need to guide your piece through your saw, allowing you to create pretty large pieces of work. So now that we have gone through all of the different types of blades, I want to quickly show you how to load a blade into your scroll saw. And again, I'm using my DeWalt DW7088 saw. When you get your scroll saw blade, so I just have a typical reverse tooth blade here, the plain ends being flat on both sides. What you want to make sure when you're going to load your blade is the majority of the teeth are pointing down and the smaller section are pointing up. It can be a little bit tricky to see because those teeth are so small. Typically, when the teeth start to point up, there's a larger gap at the bottom of the blade, so you can look for that. When you're loading it into your saw, you want to make sure the teeth are facing towards you. You'll bolt it into the top, and then you can go ahead and bolt it into the bottom as well. It's a little tricky when you can't see it. So then, here we go. A lot of loading things into scroll saws can be personal preference as well. So when you're putting in your blade, everybody's going to insert it slightly differently. You can have it a little bit high, a little bit low, And because of that, setting the tension of your saw is also going to become a really personal preference. Typically, when I'm loading my scroll saw blade, you can see here it's super, super flexible. It can move back and forth. You want to make sure you're increasing your tension so that that blade is not very flexible at all. And typically for me, based on how I load it, it is about a 2 to 2.5 before that blade is tight enough. Some people will ping it because they're tuning it. I'm not very musical, so that doesn't really work for me. It's more of a feel. So I'm going to get into a little bit later some of the issues and errors that can come up when your tension isn't set correctly. But as I said, you'll get a feel for it as you have more experience on your saw. So now that we've reviewed the blade numbering system, different types of blades, how to get your blade loaded into your machine, you can start cutting things. A scroll saw can handle a wide variety of materials, from wood and plastics to acrylics and metals. It can really cut anything as long as you have the proper blade. The materials that I want to review with you today are materials that I commonly use myself to create signs like this. And as I go, I'm going to be talking about the different blade selections that I make when I'm using those materials. So the first material I have with me here is MDF. MDF is a really great material when you are using a scroll saw because it comes in large sheets like plywood. You're not limited by the size of your material for the project that you're creating. It comes in a variety of thicknesses. You can see I have 1/8 inch, 1/4, 1/2, and 3/4 inch with me today. You can get this at typically any hardware store, and it's fairly inexpensive. MDF is also really good if you're looking at creating things with a paint finish. It's a product that is very good for paint as well. If I were to cut just one piece of 1/8 inch MDF, my blade selection would be something with a low number. When you're cutting thin material, you want to make sure you're not using something too aggressive and you want something clean cutting. So for 1/8 inch, I would likely choose a number 2 or a number 3 blade with a reverse tooth. MDF is basically a compressed paper product. If I were to use a blade that was too aggressive, if I was going to go with a number 5 or a number 7, in all likelihood, this material would rip apart and it would have a lot of kind of fuzzy fibers that would come up as you're cutting. So that's why you want to make sure you use that lower number blade. The same goes for 1/4 inch. I would be using probably a number 3 blade, again with a reverse tooth to reduce that tear out. For the thicker pieces, the 1/2 inch and the 3/4 inch MDF, I would be going with a number 5 blade, again with a reverse tooth. When you're first starting out on the scroll saw, because there are so many different types of blades, it can be really confusing. I typically recommend to people to always start with a number 5 blade. A number 5 blade is right in the mid-range. It's not going to be too fast because the TPI is too high, but it's also not going to be too aggressive because it's too thick. So a number 5 blade is a really great place to start. The next type of material I have is plywood. Plywood is also a very versatile material. There's a ton of different kinds. It comes in large sheets, again, so you're not limited to the size of your project. But as a scroll saw artist, I can tell you, I have tried a ton of different plywoods, and the best choice I have found is birch plywood. The reason for that is when you look at the profile of plywood, you can see it is made by layers. These 3 here are birch plywood. The birch plywood has multiple layers, it's really thick, good quality, and there aren't any gaps or voids. If you were to take your typical good one side plywood, you can see the profile is much different. The good one side plywood is very rough, and a lot of the times when you are using that style, there can even be large gaps or voids in the plywood. If you're cutting something very delicate, like a word or a letter like this, and you used a plywood that had gaps or voids, in all likelihood, you would have large holes in the side of your work, or it could possibly also break when you're cutting it. So when you're choosing your plywood, you want to make sure that you're going with something that is very thick and a decent quality. For me, that is Russian or Baltic birch. It's not your general shop grade birch, but you can still find this at large hardware stores and your typical lumber mill. For 1/4 inch birch, I would choose a low number blade, again with a reverse tooth. Plywood in nature is made out of layers. If you were to use an aggressive cutting blade like a skip tooth or something with too high of a number, what ends up happening is you will rip the top and bottom layers, and you'll have a lot of issues with splintering and even the entire top layer peeling off. So a low number blade, a number 3 with a reverse tooth is what I would choose for a 1/4 inch piece of birch. 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch birch are much harder. So for the 1/2 inch, I would use my go-to number 5 blade with a reverse tooth. But for the 3/4 inch, I would move up to a number 7 or a number 9 blade with a reverse tooth as well. This material here looks very similar to MDF. However, it's not. This is called Xtera. This is a manufactured product that is specifically made for outdoor use. If you're making signs for exterior use, it's a really great option for your scroll saw because it cuts very similar to MDF and also finishes really nicely with paint. When I'm cutting 1/2 inch Xtera, because it is a denser, thicker product than MDF is, I typically use a number 7 blade, again with a reverse tooth. Because this is a manufactured product, it will be susceptible to things like tear out and having that fuzzy edge if you are using a blade that's too aggressive. The 3/4 inch Xtera is very heavy. I wish you could feel the difference between this and MDF because it's probably about 3 times the weight. Because of that, I will be bringing out my strongest blade, which would be the number 12 blade with a reverse tooth in order to get the best cut on this material. Speaking of very hard materials, you can also cut hardwoods on your scroll saw. So I have a 1 inch piece of walnut and a 1/2 inch piece of maple here. With hardwoods, because you don't have to worry so much about the tear out of products like this, you can go ahead and use the more aggressive cutting blades like your skip tooth or regular tooth blade. For walnut, I typically would use a number 9 or number 12 skip tooth blade if I was cutting on my scroll saw. And then for the 1/2 inch maple, I would go with a number 7 or a number 9 blade, probably a skip tooth or a reverse tooth if I wanted it to cut a bit faster. So now that we have reviewed blades, loading your blade into your saw, different types of materials, you're ready to start planning your first project on your saw. So when I am going to make a project like this, I typically design it just on my home computer. I'm not the most tech savvy person, so I don't have fancy software. I just use what came free on my computer. I have a Mac, so I typically use Keynote. If you're working on a PC, you could use something as simple as Microsoft Word or PowerPoint. So this is a design. I'm going to be doing a Christmas sign collection soon, and this is just a simple one that I'm going to have in it. I've downloaded my fonts, put it into my program, and set it to scale. So I printed this out using a large format printer because I typically send multiple signs at a time to be printed, but you could also print this on your home computer at home. So once you have your design printed out, you want to choose your material based on what finish you want it to have. For me, I want this to be a painted sign for indoor use. And because of that, I'm going to go ahead and choose 1/2 inch MDF to cut out my design. So what you'll want to do is have your product or your material ready, cut to size to fit on your scroll saw. So this design can fit right on top of this material to be ready for cutting. One of the very first mistakes that I made when I started scroll sawing was gluing this paper pattern directly to the material. So I used spray adhesive to attach my designs. And the issue with that is when you look at this design, you can see it has some very thin detailed sections. If I glue this paper directly to my material and successfully cut it out, when I go to sand off that really permanent glue and paper, it is going to be very difficult not to break my delicate design once it's cut. Another thing that can happen if you glue your design directly to your material is that MDF is a very absorbent material, and plywood can be as well. If you spray glue on top of that surface, some of that is going to be absorbed into your material. So even if you spend a lot of time sanding that paper and glue off, it is still going to be in the material. When you use something like a spray finish on top of that, what can end up happening is a chemical reaction between the residual glue and the paint that you're putting on top of that. It can cause your paint to crinkle and wrinkle, or possibly not even adhere at all. So in order to save yourself that trouble, what I recommend is getting something like just your typical painter's tape, or you can even get something like this. It's shelf liner or contact paper. It's basically a large sticker that you can put on top of your material. And then once it's covered, you can then use the spray glue to stick your pattern on top. When you're done cutting, it simply peels off and you don't have to worry about having to sand that sticky mess off. So as I said, that's a mistake I made, and hopefully it's one that you can avoid by me sharing that with you today. Once you have your design adhered to your material, what you'll do next is plan your cuts. When you look at this design, you can see there are various sections that will be considered the interior or inside cuts. You'll have to drill a pilot hole in each of these in order to feed your scroll saw blade through to cut them out. To do that, you can use just your typical drill. But what I have found is that with these holes here, your normal drill will work. You can use a 1/16 drill bit. It'll go through perfectly fine. If I were to scale this down and put this on a smaller round, like a 10-inch or 8-inch round, those interior cuts are going to get much, much smaller. A typical drill won't be able to go through those tiny holes. So what I use is a micro drill bit. You can get an adapter that will go in a normal drill. However, what I have found is that a normal drill can be much too powerful for the smaller drill bits. I have a rotary tool with a small drill attachment that the micro drill bits can work in. The reason why I like using the rotary tool over your standard drill is because this is variable speed. So I'm able to slow it down in order to accommodate the smaller drill bits so they don't break quite as frequently. So once you've gone ahead and you've drilled all of your interior cuts, you're going to want to go ahead and start with those interior cuts. If I were to try to cut out the exterior first and do the word and then the inside cuts, again, because this is going to be very thin and delicate, it will be very tricky to do those interior cuts if you cut that out first. In all likelihood, you will break your piece. So to save that heartache, I always recommend start with your interior cuts, get those done, then drill your exterior pilot hole to do the outside cut. When you are doing your exterior cuts, a lot of the times you are going to be tempted to just cut from the outside edge of your material in. However, that can cause a lot of issues down the road when you're cutting. When you do the first portion of your word, it might be fine. But as you get around and you're in your second half, what will happen is the material will start to separate. When you're cutting on your scroll saw, you really want to make sure that you have both hands on your piece. You're going to be bracing your work and you're going to be guiding it through the blade. If one hand is focusing on holding that material together, in all likelihood, you're not going to be focusing as much as you should on what you're doing, which can be dangerous. But it also can cause a lot of uneven cuts if you're not paying attention. So again, when you're cutting, start with those interior cuts, drill your exterior pilot hole, and then cut the exterior portion of your work. So I mentioned earlier that there can be a lot of issues when you're cutting in terms of things like setting your tension. The other thing that comes into play is setting your speed. One of the very first mistakes that I made is when I was cutting out words or letters like this, what I would notice is the thickness on the top, it would be wider and then more narrow on the bottom. And obviously when you're cutting, you want to make sure that it is the same thickness on both sides. You want a really even cut. What can happen is when you're setting your tension, if you set it too low and that blade is still pretty flexible, when you are guiding your material into the blade can flex, causing that uneven cut. So you want to make sure that tension is tight enough that your blade is not going to be moving back and forth when you're guiding your blade through your material through the blade. The other reason why you can get really uneven cuts on the bottom is due to the speed. So on the DeWalt saw, it's a variable speed saw. The speed goes from 1 through 8. Most saws on the market today are variable speed as well. When you set the speed, when you first start out, it can be a little bit intimidating and you're probably going to try to start pretty slow. The issue with going too slow, again, is you want your scroll saw to be doing the work. You want the blade to be doing the cutting. If you are forcing and pushing your material through the blade, even if your tension is set properly, if that speed is too slow, you're going to be applying a lot of pressure to the blade, causing it to flex, which will result in those uneven cuts. To solve this, as I said, the first thing to note is try to see if your tension might be too low. If that doesn't correct it, I suggest increasing your speed. Let the blade do the work and ensure that you have a really smooth cut when you're starting out. The next thing that you might run into is your blade breaking quite frequently. So scroll saw blades will break. They're very small. The teeth will wear down over time, and when the teeth wear down, eventually they will snap. But if you find you've just loaded a blade, you've cut for 30 seconds and the blade snaps on you, there could be a few issues. The first one is going to be the tension being too high. So if you've tightened that blade too much and it has absolutely zero give, as soon as you apply any pressure with your material going into that blade, it's very likely that it can snap. So even if it's just a micro adjustment, try lowering your tension a bit if you find that happening really frequently. The other thing with blades breaking, again, it can be a factor of speed. If your scroll saw is going too slow, and again, you're applying a lot of pressure on your material, pushing it through that blade, it can break because the blade isn't able to keep up with the amount of pressure you're putting into it. So again, increasing your speed can really help resolve that issue if you find your blade to be breaking quite frequently. Another thing that can happen when you are cutting on your scroll saw is bouncing. So when you're cutting, you want to make sure that you have both hands on your material, you're holding it down, you're guiding your work through the blade. If you feel like you're having to use both hands to really apply pressure to that material and it's still bouncing, that can also be due to speed. If your scroll saw is going too slow, the teeth of the blade will catch your material and pull it up and down rather than being able to cut through it. So if you find your material is bouncing, again, try increasing that speed to see if it will help. If at any time when you are cutting on your scroll saw, you feel out of control, if you feel like things are going too fast and you can't cut properly, you're going off of the lines, in all likelihood, the main issue is you are going too fast. I know I said a lot of the issues can come from going too slow, but with the scroll saw, it is a game of patience. You are going to learn over time what works for you and what doesn't. And if you try to start too fast, it can be really discouraging. So like I said, if you feel out of control, play around with that speed to get it to somewhere that you're comfortable with. Just to give you guys a starting point, if I were to cut out this pattern, I'm going to be using 1/2 inch MDF. So for these small inside cuts, I would be using a reverse tooth blade of some kind, and my speed on my DeWalt saw, I would be pretty low, probably around a 3 or a 4, making sure I'm getting a really tight, clean cut. When I move to the outside portion, you can see that's super thin. I'm not going to be going max speed on something like this because I want to make sure I'm getting an accurate cut. So again, with the same number 5 blade, I would likely be going probably around a 6 or a 7 on that pattern. That's what works for me. It's meant to be a starting point, something you can try out. It doesn't necessarily mean the exact same thing would work for you, but hopefully by going through some of the issues that I've faced, you'll be able to have a better understanding of what adjustments you can make in order to be successful in cutting your projects. So hopefully now you've planned your project, you've cut it out, you're ready to start finishing. The best thing about scrolling is you really have creative freedom in terms of what you want to do once you have your piece cut out. As I said, a lot of the times when I'm using MDF, what I want to do is have a really cool painted finish afterwards. In order to get that, what you'll need to do is start by sanding your work. So regardless of the type of blade, even if you have the cleanest cut, you're going to want to make sure you're prepping your surface for the finish. It needs to be a really consistent, smooth surface to make sure you have that really smooth finish. With delicate pieces like this, you're not going to want to use a power sander. Something like your typical orbital sander would likely break this. If you're lucky enough to have a variable speed one, you might be able to make it work. But typically when I'm sanding something like this, I'm going to be sanding it by hand. So I have a couple of tools that I really like to use when I'm sanding. The first one is this. It's just a foam sanding pad that has removable sandpaper strips that come in a variety of grits. It's easy on your hands and really simple to use. When I'm sanding MDF, typically what I do is I focus on the side, and then I will do the top, clean up the back. But what I'm really focusing on doing is removing the really hard edge at the top. So I literally will just go through and lightly sand that off. The reason for that is because when I'm doing paint finishes, I'm typically using a spray finish. When you're using spray paint, you really need to make sure you have a smooth surface in order for it to adhere properly. If I leave that really sharp edge, what can end up happening is the spray paint will literally hit the edge and roll right off. You'll end up with a shadow or even that material exposed. So you really want to make sure you sand that surface so that it's really ready for a spray finish. Some other sanding tools that I use, you can get these flexible foam pads. They can get into some really narrow spaces, so I like to use those. You can even just use your typical sandpaper disc. So fold them up into sections and you can get into those really tight corners. I mentioned earlier that I have a rotary tool. So this rotary tool, again, it's variable speed. So I'm able to slow this down quite a bit. It also has sanding attachments that you can use. Drum sanders, disc sanders. You can get really cool rounded edges if you want. So that's something I'll use, not all the time, but if I'm looking to add a ton of dimension, this is something that I really like to use. So in terms of different types of paint, there's a ton of different spray paint that you can use, and I've brought a few of the ones that I commonly use with me today to show you. With MDF especially, what you want to make sure is that you have a good first coat or a primer coat of paint before you put on your final paint coats. So you can get typical spray paint primer at really any store. So I have your general primer and then a filler primer here. These are really great products because they dry super fast. So when you spray your material, the primer will dry typically within 15 minutes. You'll be able to sand it smooth and get it ready for your paint coat. The one thing to keep in mind with spray finishing is that it operates within recoat windows. So primer is great, it dries fast, you can sand it, but it's super important to remember that the next coat needs to be applied within the same hour, typically, of spray paints. So if you're doing a top coat of spray paint, again, you'll have to work within that window. For me personally, I'm a work-at-home mom, I have 2 kids running around. Typically, I don't have time to do all of my spray painting within 1 hour. Because of that, your first coat could really be a coat of this paint primer, the only difference being that this is going to have to dry longer before you sand and apply your top coat. The reason why I want to mention that as well is I believe this can of primer is currently $15 in Canada, and a can of paint is about $11. So if time is most important to you, primer is a great choice. However, if cost and you have less time available, using a paint primer combo works as well. For spray paint, if you're using it inside, you don't always have to have a top coat applied because the way that spray paint is formulated, you don't necessarily need that additional coat on top. If it's outside, it always will require an outdoor finish. But as I said, if you want to do a top coat to give it a really smooth appearance, you definitely can do that. My main recommendation is making sure that you are using a sealer that is water-based. So this is a water-based spray sealer that I have with me today. And the reason why I advise water-based is because oil-based products in nature will yellow or amber over time. It might amber immediately as you spray it. So if you're using paint, if you use an oil-based spray sealer on white, it will likely turn yellow, if not immediately, over time. For colored spray paints, it will typically darken that color. So again, that's why you typically want to make sure you're using a water-based sealer on top of your paint. Another thing to keep in mind with spray finishing is that spray paint can be really finicky in terms of weather. I'm in Canada. So it can be very humid and hot in the summer and then very cold in the winters. I spray paint outside because I don't have a space in my home that's safe to do it inside. So I can be really, struggling to have weather that allows for good spray finishing. In those cases, I will actually paint by hand. So I'll just take your typical craft paint brushes and use... I knew one thing would go wrong, guys, but thankfully I already talked about that. So as I was saying, sometimes I will do painting by hand. So you can get craft paint at your dollar store. One of the things I really like to do is get paint samples. So any hardware store that does paint, like paint for your house, you can get custom tinted samples of this size in really any color of the rainbow. So what I do with this is I'll typically put it in a palette, mix it with a little bit of water, use a craft paintbrush, and you'll get a really nice smooth finish with that as well. And again, that's really great if you're in a place where the weather can be an issue. Painting by hand will save you a lot of time if your spray finishing isn't working due to the weather. So we have gone through a ton of information today, different blades, different woods, how to set up your project for cutting, a ton of different finishes. There's one thing before I jump to questions that I want to address, which really should be the first, and that is safety. So obviously there's a ton of scroll saws on the market. Make sure you're reading your instruction manual for what they say. But when you are cutting on your scroll saw, the materials can be very dusty, specifically MDF and plywood. Those are manufactured products that have things like glues and chemicals within them. So you want to make sure you're wearing a really good dust mask. This is a Trend Technology dust mask. I've used a ton of different ones. This one for me is a personal preference because when I'm cutting on my scroll saw, I'm typically cutting for hours at a time. This one is really lightweight and the filters are easily replaceable. Eye protection, super important as well to keep you from the dust. And when you're cutting the scroll saw, although quiet, it's still recommended to always have ear protection, either earmuffs or the in-ear soundproof as well. When you are doing spray finishing, so working with things like spray glue, spray paint, sealers, or even epoxy, this style respirator is really great. You can see that it's much different looking than your dust mask. A normal dust mask will not protect you from the aerosols of a spray can. So using a respirator specifically formulated for aerosols is great. This one also has the eye protection built right in. So I find this one to be really handy to be safe when I'm doing things like this. And it also even works for epoxy if you are looking at doing epoxy work. So I know that was a lot of information, guys. I'm going to see if I can address some of the questions as they have come up here. So let's take a look. So Xterra. So Xterra is a specialized product. As I said, it's not going to be found in your normal hardware store. This product is made by a company called Miratech. So you can go to that website and find dealers that will sell it locally. If you're in the Toronto area, I personally get mine from a place called Century Mill Lumber. I believe their address is in Uxbridge. But typically lumber mills, if you are requesting that, they'll be able to source that product for you. So interior cuts. Yes, so interior cuts, let me just hold up this design for you. Interior cuts are the sections where you will have to drill a pilot hole in order to cut them. So in fonts, it would be all of the inside areas of the loops of the letter. When you're looking at this kind of fancy and, you can see this loop connects at the bottom. So this portion would be an interior cut as well. And again, the reason why I always recommend doing those first is because you'll then cut the exterior portion out afterwards. And if you cut that out first, it's going to be really tricky to get inside and cut those effectively. In this project, would I start with the word and or the R's in Mary? So for me, like I said, I do the interior cuts of all of it. So if I had this glued to my board, I'm going to go through and cut the inside portions of every single word. And then I'm going to drill my exterior hole and then go back and cut the whole thing out. So what type of mask do I use with MDF? Again, you want to make sure you have that really good dust mask. The filters, you actually just twist the side and the filter pops out. So you'll want to make sure you replace those every few months, but you really just need to make sure you have a dust mask that's rated for the materials you're using. So do I have a dust collection system in my shop? I do. So I have a DeWalt saw and I actually have a DeWalt dust extractor. I have a piping system. It's called a Scrollnado. You can actually make a version yourself. I wouldn't actually recommend the Scrollnado product because it's really just flexible plastic, but it's tubing that goes to the top and the bottom of the saw, attach it to my dust extractor, and it removes the dust as I cut. It's really great. My shop is in my house, in my basement, so that's a really important part for me to make sure that I have good dust collection. I also have one of the ceiling mounted air scrubbers that runs while I'm using my saw. So dust collection is super important. And yeah, you can find really cool ways to attach it to any type of scroll saw. So another question I see there, what blade do I use the most? So the blade that I use the most is the one I recommend the most. That's going to be your number 5 reverse tooth blade, whether that's a modified geometry blade, double reverse, or typical reverse tooth blade. I find those to be the most clean cutting for the materials that I use and also the fastest cutting in terms of how I like to cut. Any recommendations for 1-inch maple having a really hard time? So 1-inch maple is really thick. What you'll want to do is have a pretty aggressive cutting blade. If you've already tried a number 12 skip tooth blade, I would go into a reverse tooth blade, see if that can give you a cleaner cut, but you're gonna want to bring out something that can handle a really thick material. So for me, my first instinct would be to try a skip tooth blade. Okay, so are there any, a lot of them are about dust collection. So I think I went through pretty in detail about the dust collection. The main thing is you'll probably need to build some kind of jig that can attach a system to your saw. This part of the saw here is a blower. So this is actually just blowing the dust so it's out of your field of vision. When I have the dust collection attached, there's a little hose that comes right here. So the blower is actually blowing the dust right into the hose, which then goes into my dust extractor. Would a hand scroll saw work for projects? So I think you mean like the ones you actually use by hand, not a power saw. You definitely could. It's going to take you quite a bit more time, but the concept is the same. You're going to be drilling the pilot holes to accommodate the little handheld blade that you would then go through to cut your design out. It might take a little bit longer, but it would be really cool to say it's fully handmade, not using any power tools. So definitely you could try. Is there a way for people to wear a dust mask with glasses? That's a little bit tricky because I think it would really depend on the shape of your face. Like if I were to put this right up against my face here, you can see where it hits the bridge of my nose. I do wear safety glasses on top of that, and it does tend to kind of push the glasses up slightly. What I would probably end up doing is either going to a store that has dust masks in stock that you could kind of try them on your face to see if the glasses could align. I don't know how much something like that would be, but I know you can get custom prescription safety glasses as well. So that might be something you'd want to look into. Spiral blades can be used for any kind of work. That was a question from Diana. So spiral blades, you could use it for a design like this. Just keeping in mind that spiral blades are a very fast cutting blade. So they can be pretty tricky if you're trying to do something really detailed, but some people have really mastered them and it's the only thing that they use. For me, it's not my preference, but if I'm cutting something really big and I'm not able to turn it in my saw, that's when I'll pull out my spiral tooth blades. So although you can use them for everything, for me personally, I typically only use them when I'm cutting something really, really large. How do I arrange a design for layered pieces? So layered projects, when you're looking at this one here, you can see that there's various dimension to it. So this is something that I cut in layers. And we'll have to let us know. Maybe down the road, I would do a more detailed session on how to do stack cutting and creating more dimension like that. But typically what you would do, if I was cutting out this and I wanted this to be 1/2 inch material and this to be 1/4 inch material, what I simply would do is take my pieces of MDF. So I have a 1/2 inch piece here, a 1/4 inch piece here. What I would do is either tape that together, put a small nail through it, or glue along the edges. And then I'd glue my pattern on top, and you're literally cutting it out just like you would normally. So once you're done, you're actually going to have 2 pieces, one 1/4 inch and one 1/2 inch, in order to create that really multi-dimensional look. So it's actually pretty simple once you get started. It's just figuring out how you want those layers to appear. So I have removed, there is a guard that comes with your DeWalt saw. I'm not sure all scroll saws have it. It's like a material hold down piece, and it is definitely something that you should have on your saw. It is a safety measure to hold down your material as you work. A lot of people do tend to remove it, but as I said, it's super important to make sure that you are following the instructions in your manual and using it appropriately. Michael's asking, how do you realign the cut words on the final board for level alignment? So do you mean gluing the final words on the project at the end? Typically what I do is if I have my printed out design and my backer, I'll simply put the design onto that piece of wood and either use like a transfer paper, graphite paper, or even just color pencil on the back of it. And you can trace it right on once you've lined it up, so you know exactly where to glue it. A lot of people use like laser levels, or you can even just kind of eyeball it and then put pieces of tape of where you want to glue it. But that's typically how I do it. I will trace on my design before I glue it down. Okay, do we have time for a few more questions? Okay, perfect. So Steven's asking, can you describe how to avoid chattering on the scroll saw, even if you adjust the tension up or down? So when you're getting a lot of vibration in your work on your saw, as I said, one of the issues can be the speed, but it could potentially also be the blade that you're using. So depending on the material that you're trying to cut, you really want to make sure that you've made the proper blade choice. If you're trying to cut something really thick, like a 1 inch piece of maple, and you're using a number 3 or a number 5 blade, that blade is probably not strong enough to handle the material that you're cutting, which can cause a lot of vibration. So if you're still having that issue, I would definitely try adjusting the blade that you've chosen. But again, if that continues to happen, you've tried everything, there could be an issue with the saw in general if it's really making a lot of noise and you've tried all of that. So you could always take it in for a service or see if it's still under warranty as well. Okay, awesome. Do we have more questions today? Okay, well, I think that reviews everything. I really hope you've enjoyed the session today. Make sure that you're following Lee Valley Tools on all socials, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and let us know what you'd like to see next. I've had a really great time with you today, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Thank you.